No problem. I think it's important really to broadcast as much as possible. So to speak as much as possible about this case that is so important. So just tell me when you are ready.
We're ready.
I will ask. Yes, we are ready.
Okay, you can start.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much to be here. You know, we are the Festival Millennium. The Festival Millennium was created in 2009 because it is created by documentaries, by I'm a filmmaker and a producer, and anyway with friends who are engaged in the big issues of our world today. And one, as we work in many places in the world, we were working long time with Médecins Sans Frontières. So we covered wars, we covered crises, many difficult situations, and we're thinking that it is very important to make the connection between these big issues and the artists, the engaged artists, because anyway, I think the artists are giving another image and other perception of all this. And so when I saw that there was less than 1% of the population that knew about the SDGs, so we thought, yes, we have to do something. Like artists, we have to do something, because the documentaries is giving the information, because it is made by very engaged people, by very engaged artists who are spending sometimes more than 5-10 years to make one film, and they're giving us a sincere and authentic information about what is happening. And today we have the 15th edition of the Millennium Festival, and I have to say that we have a very interesting program with a lot of films coming from the Oscars. They were at the Oscars at the same time. We had artists that I were very honored to have here, Ai Weiwei. But for me, the most important today is to show the Filmiteca and to have Stella Assange. That all my congratulations, because what you are doing is incredible. On your fragile shoulder, you took a so important mission. And anyway, because you think that today the most important for the world is to support le lanceur d'alerte. Assange is a kind of symbol of the freedom of information, of the freedom of giving the right information, of the freedom to inform, the freedom of expression. So he is a kind of really symbol, and if we, I can't say it even so beautifully as Ai Weiwei told, it will be the big crush if he is condemned, if he is extradited. It will be really a shame, a big crush for our democratic law, for our democracy. So, yes, maybe Stella, you can say a few words about all this action that you're doing now, and after I think that it is up to you to ask the question, because the media, anyway, the most important support.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for having Ithaca at the festival and for inviting me. I think if you see the film, when you see the film, you'll see what we were trying to do as Julian's family who are behind this film, to show the reality of the situation. And it originated around 2019, when Julian was already in prison, and his brother Gabriel is a producer, film producer. And Julian was in a desperate situation, and when Julian was arrested, it felt like the world was crashing down, and how can we possibly fight? How do we do this? And there is no preset set of rules or indications about how to fight back. But the starting point is, well, what do we know and what have we got? And what we knew, what Julian's brother knew, is how to produce films. And what we've got was our lives, the truth of the situation, and our understanding of the persecution and the attack against Julian. And so, combining these things, we decided to document the fight for Julian's freedom. And the film, I see it as a vehicle, mainly, to allow people in, to allow people to have to understand what is being done to Julian from a completely different perspective to what they have been presented over the years, and to discuss about what's at stake. And what's at stake isn't, as we explore in the film, the future of journalism hangs on this case. But what's being done to Julian is of such importance that if we lose it, we lose all our rights. And that's not an exaggeration. It's not like the world can go by as Julian withers in prison or gets sentenced for publishing true information from his source, Chelsea Manning. There's a before and an after, and if this is allowed to continue, then it's a dismantling of our democratic rights. If we win this, we actually preserve what we had when Julian first published in 2010. So the way I see this is a trajectory into a total collapse of democracy, a total collapse of the rule of law, total collapse of the freedom of the press.
Merci, thank you. We speak in French and we'll introduce. Je ne vois pas comment les médias mainstream, porte-parole des gouvernements et suppôts du monde financier, propriété de grands groupes industriels, de milliardaires, pourraient tout à coup traiter impartialement le cas de Julian Assange. Peut-on attendre un renversement de situation sans une médiatisation à grande échelle?
So I don't see how mainstream media as spokesperson of government and assisting people of the financial world, ownership of huge industrial groups, billionaires, and could eventually help to treat impartially Julian Assange case. And what do you think about that? And could we expect a turning point, like a switch, and without upscale mediatization?
Well, I'm of the view that if the legacy press had actually done its job, Julian would not have spent a single day in prison. There has been a shift, though. There was a joint statement by the New York Times and Der Spiegel, Le Monde, El País, and The Guardian. These were the 5 original big partners. And that joint statement, well, it should have happened many years ago, but it marks a before and an after, and I think it's very significant, because the significance is that it's kind of broken into the establishment consciousness that this case is a problem. And that's because this case, the implications of this case are so significant that even those institutions, when they are presented with information that they know will be controversial for those in power, for powerful interests, they understand that this case is what enables them to be silenced. In practice, either they publish and then they will feel the backlash of a criminal case against them, or they just don't publish. And not publishing means they don't risk expensive legal cases, they don't risk prison, they don't risk huge fines, they don't risk bankruptcy. So I think that's what's driving this joint statement and so on, is an actual coming to realize finally an understanding of the press freedom implications of the case.
Thank you.
Hi. So you were talking about the fact that the future of free journalism is at stake, and you were talking about the importance of showcasing this for the sake of human rights. At the same time, some activists from the Me Too movement are still raising questions regarding the allegations that happened in Sweden. I don't know if you remember I believe they were rape, sexual allegations against Mr. Assange, and that case expired. There was no further research on that. So some activists are saying, okay, what happened to that? Some Me Too activists, so could you comment on that?
Yes, I'd recommend that they read Niels Meltzer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture's book, The Trials of Julian Assange. They should also read another book by Stefania Marizzi, an investigative journalist in Italy, who has won, I think it's 3 awards now for that book, that looks at the behind the scenes, what was going on between the Swedish and the UK governments during the period where this preliminary investigation was not progressing. They should also look at the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention's decision, number 54, 2015, that went into a 14-month investigation into this, concluded that Sweden had abused its powers and that Julian was the victim of an abuse of process by Sweden. They should look at the Swedish Court of Appeal's decision of 2014, finding against the Swedish prosecutor saying that she had failed her duty to progress the case. They should look at the fact that Julian faces 175 years for actual charges in the United States for revealing war crimes, including the killing of civilians in minute detail.
Oui. Est-ce que vous avez encore l'occasion de parler politique avec Julian Assange, d'évoquer ce qui se passe dans le monde, par exemple l'épisode Covid-19 ou la guerre en Ukraine? Je vais rajouter que je travaille comme journaliste depuis 2-3 ans sur ce qui s'est passé avec le Covid, et on retrouve beaucoup d'éléments. Absence totale de liberté de la presse dans l'événement Covid, mainmise des multinationales comme Pfizer, Moderna, Janssen & Janssen ou d'autres. Voilà, je serais intéressé de connaître votre avis. Et je suis persuadé aussi que par rapport à la guerre en Ukraine, il ne serait pas tombé dans... Julian ne tombe pas dans le panneau.
Are you still able to talk about politics with Julian? To talk about what's happening basically in the world, and to talk about, for example, what the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, and you were saying?
Oui, on retrouve des mêmes facteurs, la même chose dans ce qui s'est passé avec le Covid, donc la mainmise des multinationales, l'absence totale de liberté de la presse avec le Covid-19 et ce qui s'est passé avec Julian, mais ce qui se passe aussi avec l'Ukraine.
Yeah, so it's similar. What happened in the pandemic, during the pandemic, to what happened with Julian, basically, absence of
Liberté de la presse.
liberty of speech and so on. What's your thought about this?
Yeah, we talk about all sorts of things, and I keep Julian up to date as much as I can about what's going on in the world. I send him articles, and lots of people also post articles to him, and books, and so on. And Julian, of course, is very hungers for information and for understanding, trying to understand the world around him. That hasn't changed. What has changed is that he's completely cut off from the world. He has no access to the internet. He can't research things himself, and of course Julian is a person who is intensely curious about understanding institutions, understanding policies, and so on. And Julian has been silenced for now 5 years, actually, a whole year before he was arrested. The Ecuadorian government refused him the ability to be able to speak out publicly on the 28th of March 2018. They told him that if he spoke publicly, if he gave any more interviews, he would be expelled from the embassy. So Julian has actually been silenced for 5 years. He's been in prison for 4. And it would be wrong for me to paraphrase Julian's opinions, or it would be wrong for several reasons. But I think most importantly, it's important for you to understand that he is being silenced, and that his voice is being deprived from you. And that is the point. That is the point of keeping him imprisoned. Everyone knows that Julian is one of probably the most well-known public intellectuals in relation to criticism of the war industry. And he fights against wars, and he is acutely aware of the threats we face as a civilization, as a humanity in general, at the moment. And he shares, a deep worry and concern, as I think everyone does.
Moi j'ai encore des questions. Si personne.
D'autres questions?
Moi j'ai encore des questions.
Vos collègues, est-ce qu'il y a encore quelqu'un? Ah, oui.
About all what you said, why is it so difficult for many media to understand that there is a lack of support?
Pourquoi c'est difficile aux médias?
How do you explain that? Because you show very good what is at stake now in this story, the very large view of Julian on the world of today. Why is it so difficult for many media to understand that?
Pourquoi c'est difficile pour les médias d'entendre ça?
Well, I mean, there are different explanations. Fundamentally, when Julian first appeared in 2010, he was a pioneer. He transformed, some say revolutionized, evolved journalism. He evolved journalism through the methods that WikiLeaks used. So this was just at the beginning of what was then called data journalism, large data sets of information, and how much more you could learn out of large data sets of information, combined with understanding of how the internet worked, and therefore how sources were at risk if you used traditional means of journalism, SMS, phone calls, and so on, which is what was the standard at the time, even in The Guardian, the New York Times, and so on, they were using SMS and phone calls to speak to their sources. So along came Julian with his deep knowledge of how cryptography works and how the internet is constructed, and made this fundamental innovation where you have the capability of constructing a media organization that can guarantee source anonymity. And it is still the fact that WikiLeaks has never revealed a source, has never involuntarily, unlike, for example, The Intercept, who has, I think, 3 sources who have been or are in prison, including Daniel Hale, a reality winner, and I forget the third. So WikiLeaks has a perfect record of source anonymity. And then the collaboration between media organizations. So WikiLeaks was the first to make this collaborations that now you see with the ICIJ and so on. And in fact, they were unwilling partners. It was very difficult. It was the first time they had ever been thrust into a situation where The Guardian had to cooperate with the New York Times and Der Spiegel, El País, and so on, because it is against the way they had done things. And so when Julian came along, he introduced all of a sudden all these game-changing innovations into journalism. And so you had, for example, the New York Times and The Guardian completely outdone by this new player, a small player, who was entirely reader supported. WikiLeaks only gets support from donations, and they were constrained by their government sources, they were constrained by advertising, they were constrained by their social status. And WikiLeaks introduced this freedom to publish securely, and that's why WikiLeaks has, to date, had the greatest, the best, most significant journalistic scoops in history. Still, the diplomatic cables are a treasure trove for journalists, for historians, for academics, etc. Okay, so he came onto the scene, and then reputationally, these big institutions also felt attacked. Who knows the name of the editor of the New York Times? Still today. Maybe you do, you're journalists. But the average person on the street, they knew Julian Assange. They knew WikiLeaks. They didn't know who Bill Keller was. So this was also a big reputational hit for them. So then they tried to differentiate Julian. Oh, he's not like us. But the point is that what WikiLeaks does and what it was doing was always journalism. It was receiving information from a source. It was making that information available to the public. Since 2010, what's happened? Well, there's a former Deputy Attorney General of the US who wrote a very interesting article called The WikiLeaksization of the American Press, which says, actually, all these innovations that Assange and WikiLeaks introduced have become commonplace in the big newsrooms now. The anonymous Dropbox, the partnerships, and so on. So over time, basically, the newsrooms adopted the WikiLeaks model. They adopted it. And so what you're left with is an attitude of journalists that I think didn't get the memo, or haven't actually done the legal analysis of the case, which is an attack on receiving information and making it public, which is true information of the highest public interest. And what I see often is just a projection. So there are these debates like, oh, he's not a journalist. What does that actually mean? Because the answer is, well, what is a journalist? And they never define it. They never define what a journalist is. Okay, is writing articles being a journalist? Julian's done that. Is having an official membership card from a journalist union being a journalist? Well, Julian has those. He's written hundreds of articles. He's done analysis. He is called on whenever there's, whenever there was some policy change on data protection or whatever. He is a commentator. He's a journalist. Of course he's a journalist. I mean, no serious person would actually take any time and to defend this point, because it's just a position. It's a projection to saying, oh, Assange is different. It was just a pose, a claim to pretend, to project that I don't support Assange. But the thing is that now you have this joint statement by The Guardian, The New York Times, El País, Der Spiegel, Le Monde, and they recognize that Julian is being prosecuted as a journalist. And this was evident from day one when the US unsealed its indictment. That he is not being prosecuted as a whistleblower, he's not being prosecuted as a source or anything other than journalistic activity. And that is why they put out this joint statement, recognizing that actually the case against him criminalizes journalism. So I find it's very rare now to get people saying, oh, he's not a journalist.
There is a subtlety there, because when the Le Monde has reproduced the common appeal in favor of Julian, in the beginning of the article, they don't say the journalist, they say the whistleblower.
Do they say the publisher?
This is systematic.
Do they
Some media in some place, they will be confused.
Il dit que le Monde traite ça subtilement parce qu'ils disent qu'il n'est pas journaliste, mais lanceur d'alerte.
It's important, it's legally significant that he is being prosecuted as a publisher. Because if often I find, although these issues are linked, you cannot put him in the same bag as Chelsea Manning, Snowden, etc. Because first of all, Chelsea Manning and Snowden are US citizens, and they were working for intelligence agencies and the Pentagon at the time, who have some kind of oath towards the US government. Okay, they should be protected for being whistleblowers anyway, but that's a completely different situation than an Australian publisher publishing from Europe in collaboration with these other publications, which published also classified US information. There is no differential in the case against Julian that does not also capture these other publications. So then you're set against, okay, well, they just decided to go after Julian, but they haven't decided to go after Le Monde. Well, yet, but what does that even mean? That means there's no safeguard. Like, that is the significance. And it's also the US acting extraterritorially. And of course, you see other countries basically the US has established a new template where you can just go after any journalist anywhere. And all you need to say is, I mean, Morocco can do that. Morocco can say, I don't like what you published about Morocco. I don't care you're Belgian. In Belgium, my laws apply to you. And Belgian press freedom laws have no effect. I'm going to extradite you. That's what the US is arguing in this case.
Thank you. Other questions?
Ouais. Quand on voit toute cette situation de l'extérieur, on perçoit toute la folie de ce monde, la torture qu'on inflige à des innocents altruistes qui veulent rendre ce monde meilleur. On se demande comment Julian a pu résiste encore. Est-ce que c'est l'amour qui le sauve?
Yeah, from outside, when we are watching, when we're thinking about the situation, when we perceive all this craziness about this world, the torture that that is done to innocents, altruist people that want to make this world a better place, we are wondering how Julian can still resist, and is that love that saves him, or against monsters, against those cold individuals?
Well, I think every person survives in one way or another with love, right? But Julian is a fighter, and he actually has very profound beliefs, and he knows what is being done to him is a profound injustice, and that there's an almighty fight for his freedom. And I think it's in Julian's instinct to just fight for what's right. And he happens to be at the center of it, and he's suffering, but he's also aware that that a lot hangs on him winning this. You know, Julian is quite extraordinary like that. He actually has he feels injustice in his bones. Other people's suffering he takes very personally, and it's just in his nature to be a fighter.
Last.
One more question. Okay.
À ma connaissance, le silence d'Amnesty est assez évocateur, Amnesty International. Olivier Van de Castel, un Belge détenu en Iran, je sais qu'il est belge, mais il bénéficie d'une campagne d'Amnesty ici en Belgique énorme. Les lieux officiels mettent des portraits géants de l'homme sur leur façade. J'aimerais bien, on a des réponses évidemment comme journaliste, mais vous entendre sur ce deux poids deux mesures par rapport à certaines personnes emprisonnées et à Julian de son côté. La dernière.
So Amnesty silence means a lot. It's very evocative. So Olivier Van de Castel is a Belgian. He's been incarcerated in Iran. He's getting legal protection from legal protection. The official people are putting a giant portrait about this man on buildings, official buildings. And Julian Assange doesn't get this attention about his fight. Sorry, Julian Assange.
So it is just about the difference to the approach.
Yeah.
Yes, for cases of human rights.
So, yeah.
Well, okay, Amnesty International have actually supported Julian. They have not, to date, declared him a prisoner of conscience, and this is really very difficult to understand, because the way they describe him is as a prisoner of conscience. They say that the prosecution against him is political, that he is being prosecuted for his work with WikiLeaks, that he should be released, and so on. But it seems that the specific prisoner of conscience denomination is a political problem for Amnesty. And in order to understand why, and I'm not saying it's impossible that they will, they won't, but of course Amnesty is partially funded by governments, by the UK government and probably also by the US government, I'm not sure, but certainly by the UK government. And it's kind of not, clearly stated, because it's only certain parts of their operations that are funded by governments. But it is a concern for them to be able to secure future funding. And so this is a little bit the NGO world in a nutshell. But there is, I would say, unanimous support from Amnesty, from Human Rights Watch, from Reporters Without Borders, from the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is the US journalist protection organization, which for some years was a little bit quiet on this, but have actually been very vocal more recently, since about a year ago. Look, political prisoners are out of their very nature, some of them are more politically useful than others for certain governments. And that's why the only correct position to have is that there should be no political prisoners. Their fate should not be dependent on whether it's convenient or not for your own government or a different, you know, authoritarian government. They're used as political scoring cards, but what you have in this case is someone who is so high profile. Julian is so high profile that having Julian in prison actually licenses other countries to keep political prisoners, because they can go, well, what about Assange? Why are you telling me in Tehran to free this Belgian man when Europe says nothing about Assange? And they're, you know, of course they're going to say that. And what does that mean? It's not whataboutism. What it is that the losers are the political prisoners who lose their life, is free speech, is freedom of the press, etc. So it should be completely intolerable. Russia just arrested a Wall Street Journal reporter under their espionage laws for the first time since the Cold War. Well, who is surprised about that? They could have done it any time since 1990, but they do it now. And the US has no moral high ground to say you can't arrest journalists under your Espionage Act, because that's exactly what they've done for Julian.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you very much. And as you thought in the beginning, it is so important for freedom, not only for Julian Assange, but for all the journalists, for all the free speech, for all the free information. And as supporting Julian Assange, I think that you are supporting the rights of journalism and information all over the world, and we support the rules and the laws of democracy. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.